Welcome to Morningstar Christian Chapel YouTube channel. Please remember to hit that subscribe button, like button, and the notification bell so you can find out when we go live or post a new video. And be sure to leave a comment about what God has shown you in this message. Thanks, and enjoy the study.
All right, let's open our Bibles this morning to Psalm 3. In Hebrew, the word psalm is Sefer Tehillim. It literally means book of praise. And indeed, Israel's songbook is this book of psalms. It is mostly intended to be accompanied by musical instruments. The Psalms is the second book in a series in the Bible known as the books of poetry and wisdom. It starts at the book of Job. It continues to the book of Song of Solomon. And they are unique in that they are designed to bring you into a day-to-day relationship with God by experience. There isn't much history in it, though there is some. There isn't necessarily a lot of prophecy in it, though there is some. But the whole focus of these books is to be able to take what you read and apply it now. It isn't for later, it's for today. And it is all about your present tense experience, the intimacy and the knowledge of God that you have, and how it affects your day-to-day life. This morning, I'd like to take you quickly through three Psalms, 3, 4, and 5. The historical setting for them is 2 Samuel, chapter 15, 16, and 17, where you will find David in his old age fleeing the palace in Jerusalem in the middle of the night with his friends and with his family in tow, as his son Abeelen leads a rebellion to overthrow his father's government, and he does so with wickedness and with a tremendous desire for murder and destruction. David leaves because he doesn't want to fight his son. He doesn't want to see the city destroyed. He wants to avoid the war. But this had in many ways been David's own doing. Years earlier, David had sinned with Bathsheba, which had precipitated much of this suffering to David and his family. One of his daughters, Tamar, had been raped by a half-brother named Ammon. David had done little to nothing about it, and so Absalom eventually took it upon himself to honor his sister, and he killed Amnon himself. Through the years, a tremendous rift developed between father and son, which eventually led to Absalom's exile. He was asked to leave the country. Eventually, David was talked into inviting him back, and he kind of came back with great reticence. And now there's this coup. And David is walking with God again. Things are fine between him and the Lord, but his heart is broken, and the consequences of sin over the years followed him. So there's an attachment there, although there has been forgiveness and restoration. And now David finds himself in this predicament, and now he's an older guy. So he flees the city of Jerusalem. He crosses the Kidron Valley. He climbs up the Mount of Olives. He eventually heads to the Jordan. He crosses over the Jordan and ends up in a place called Mahanaim, where he waits to gather his troops to see what will come next, what will the Lord do, and to seek to avoid this battle with his estranged son. His terror, his sadness, his uncertainty, but his certainty about where he stood with the Lord is really the basis for these Psalms. Psalm 3 was written in the morning after an all-night almost flight, if you will, away from the immediate threat. Psalm 4 is written that same evening. And then Psalm 5 is written the following morning. It presents to us a man that is broken in grief. He has been forgiven despite now having to face sin's consequence. And he seeks God in the uncertainties that he faces, but he's convinced that God could be trusted, and that forgiveness means that restoration. This first psalm, if you look at it, not even verse 1, just the psalm itself, has a superscription underneath it that says, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. And there's a lot of the psalms that give you the historical background. The word psalm, zamar, is a word that means melody. But the root word for this word is to prune as excess branches. And I think really by application, you can make a long speech, you can be long-winded, but when you're in trouble like David, you come right to the point. You cut everything back. And I think that's what the implication is. We will also notice as we go through these Psalms, especially in chapter 3 and 4, the word Selah comes at the end of verse 2, the end of verse 4, the end of verse 8, and then the next Psalm as well. Selah is a significant word in the Psalms. It is a call to rest or to pause. In a musical sense, it means to take a note or a beat, but in the poetic sense, it means to stop and to think it through before you go on. They're usually placed at very powerful kind of thoughts and statements. The word Salah by itself means to exalt, but it seems to be that encouragement to not read by it too quickly. So with that background, we read in verse 1, chapter Psalm 3, Lord, how have they increased who trouble me? Many there are who rise up against me, and many who say to me, is there no help for him in God? David in full flight has had a dreadful 24 hours running. And for an old timer, he's not running. He's moving along. He is concerned about just about everything around him. The future is in doubt. He had gone to sleep that night with a desire, hoping that he could set a guard about Gilead where, they could at least see his son in the army, and it was a huge army coming. Joab, his general, had woke up in the morning to see the king riding. Maybe David looked at his curious stare, and he read in verse 1 and 2 here, how many people are going to gather against me? And a lot of them are saying that God's not going to help us. What do you think, Joab? Absalom was certainly, if you go back to the history portion, winning the youth vote. He had charmed and with cleverness and personality won over a lot of folks. And David was aware that not everyone now was on his side. Maybe he remembered a descendant of Saul that had come out to yell at him when he was leaving just that night before. His name was Shammai. He hated David, tribe of Benjamin. And he came out and mocked David and basically said, God's cursed you. That's why you're suffering this. You deserve this. And many others said to him, God has forsaken him. But here's the deal. David knew that was a lie. It's like he said to his general, imagine the thought that God would turn on us. Now look, David was a fallen saint, and at least what he is facing imminently here was the consequence of his foolishness over the years as a parent. But he had years earlier turned his life back to the Lord, God had forgiven him, and though there are consequences, he fully trusted that God would now care for him, and those things from the past wouldn't need to be carried to the future. They were under the blood, if you will, in a New Testament sense. But that didn't mean this wasn't hurtful and difficult and terrifying all at once. Joab, do you think God's not with us? He goes on in verse 3 and he says, but you, O Lord, are a shield for me. You are my glory and the one who lifts up my head. And I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill. Selah. Now, if you're new to your Bible, whenever in the Old Testament you read the word Lord all in capitals, it is always the translation of the word Jehovah, which is a name that God took for himself to communicate his person. The word Jehovah means the becoming one. Whatever you need, God can become for you. He's all able in every way. And the Lord, and that's the word that's used here when those are all in capital. If you see in the Old Testament the word Lord with just a capital L but a little O-R-D, it is almost always the translation of the word Adonai. And Adonai is just a word of position. You're the boss, I'm not. You're in charge, I'm not. You're the Lord, I'm not. It's that, a place of servanthood that you recognize who you are and who he is. And he says to the Lord, the becoming one, you're my shield. His hope was not just emotional, it was clearly based upon the faithfulness of God. David was on the run, but God was not running. God's still ruling. And he recalls the times God had answered his prayers. When he was confronted with his sin by the prophet for having that affair with Bathsheba and then killing her husband Uriah, David, for a year, kept it all to himself. Those were both death penalty punishments by Jewish law. David maybe was kept from saying anything because of it. But when he finally said to the prophet, I have sinned, the prophet said, you will not die. But this will be troubling to your family. There will be consequence. And David writes here, you have been my glory, and you've been lifting my head. You've kept me through all of this stuff. Salah. Think about that. David goes on and he says, I laid down and slept, and I awoke, for the Lord has sustained me. I won't be afraid of 10,000s of his people who have set themselves against me all around. So arise, Lord, and save me, O my God. You've struck the enemies on the cheekbone. You've broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongs to the Lord, and you're going to be a blessing. You're a blessing upon your people. Selah. David wakes up a few hours after a night of travel with great faith, tremendous boldness. He calls upon the Lord to arise. He calls him, oh my God, the word God, Elohim. Elohim is a word for sovereign. There might be a million gods to man, but there's only one God, and he's supreme, Elohim. No toothless enemy can harm me. You've surrendered them harmless. Salvation comes from you. Blessing comes to your people. David was secure in the position that he found himself in, though he faced what looked like certain death and defeat. But the circumstances were still very dire. Now, Absalom did not immediately follow his father with armed forces to wipe them out. Had he done so, it would seem biblically that David would have been wiped out, and everyone with him. They were just a ragtag bunch of folks on the run at the last minute. But God had other plans. David had left a fellow behind named Hushai, had become a friend. And he said, why don't you stay here and counsel my son and try to divert his attention and maybe keep him from going this route? His son, Absalom, had developed a good relationship with what was once David's good friend, Ahithophel. And Ahithophel said to Absalom, we got to attack now. They're in disarray. They're not ready to fight. They don't have an army. It'll be a kill. It'll be easy. And Hushai said, Absalom, don't be so much of a hurry. If you go to this fight and your dad turns out tougher than any of us believe, you're going to lose all your popular support because you're going to be defeated early on. Wait a few days, a week, get an army together and make sure that nothing's left. And Absalom heeded the voice of Hushai. They gave David time to prepare. And this was his evening song, verse 4, or chapter 4 here of Psalms, when the coup hadn't come racing over the cliffs to attack and to destroy. So David writes this, hear me when I cry, O God of my righteousness. You have relieved me in my distress. Have mercy upon me and hear my prayer. How long, O you sons of men, will you turn my glory to shame? And how long will you love worthlessness and seek falsehood? I think that most of us can be very philosophical about our spiritual beliefs. We talk about them like, this is what I believe. This is what I'm convinced of. And yet, when it has to go from philosophical to personal, that can be quite a leap sometimes in people's lives. I heard a story a while back of two guys on the beach, and one was kind of wading in the water. The other guy was on the beach reading a book, and the fellow wading in the water stepped out a little too far and fell in a deep hole and began to cry out, "Hey, help me, I can't swim." And the fellow from the shore yelled out, "Well, neither can I, but you don't hear me making a big fuss about it." And I think that's the difference between philosophical outlook and personal conviction. When it has to become personal, it now has to be turned inward. So, one knew he was lost, that fellow there in the water. The other, he had no sense for his need. Well, here David's call is very personal. Look what he writes here. He says, "Hear me, relieve me, have mercy upon me." And David prays that the Lord might silence his enemies who were still loving his son, and the lies that he was telling. And Absalom's big lie was, "God sent me to wipe out my father." And people who were politically on that side said, "Amen." David goes on and he says, "But know that the Lord has set apart for himself those who are godly, and the Lord will hear when I call to him." See, personally applied. David's life had been sanctified, set apart from the world, turned to the Lord. I've had several people I've shared with say, "I don't know if I want to become a Christian, I have to give up too much." Well, yeah, you have to give up hell and misery and doubt and uncertainty. No, the Bible says God will form in you his desires in your heart. You'll desire what God wants, 2 Corinthians 5:17. You can desire what God desires. You can be set apart. You'll start to hate what you once loved and love what you once hated. And you'll find real life. But notice that David here is confident that God would hear his prayer because he was living a life now separated to him, even though there were verse 2, bunch of folks who were believing the lies of the enemy and putting David's life at peril. He then says this, "You should be angry, but not sin, and meditate in your heart upon your bed and be still." The word angry here is the Hebrew word ragos. Ragos means to stand in awe, or to quake, or to tremble. This isn't mad the way you would think of mad. This is to stand in awe of God in such a way that you would react in obedience, because to not do so is a fearful decision that you make. Don't sin. And David said, "I'm lying in bed, communing with God, and I'm able to be still because I'm anchored by the knowledge I have of who he is." Look, everything looked completely in disarray. David went to bed, closed his eyes, and said, "God, I'm glad I'm taken care of by you. I'm set apart for you. I stand in awe of you." And these guys are not going to get away with this. They are lawless and hateful. They're worthless, and they're seeking falsehood. God, I know you don't put up with that. But I do know that you set apart those for you that are godly, and you listen to their prayers. David goes on and he said in verse 5, "Offer then the sacrifices of righteousness and put your trust in the Lord." And David certainly needed to do that. The Old Testament sacrifices were either sin offerings or they were called sweet-smelling sacrifices of fellowship, of submission. So when you get to the burnt offering, the meal offering, the peace offerings of the Old Testament, they were brought by righteous people who wanted to have fellowship with God, and that they brought them willingly, and they were acceptable to God whenever they brought them. There was no timetable or demand. It was just a willing heart, a pure heart, and seeking the Lord. And David draws near and he says, "I'm going to just put my trust in the Lord." He stood in God's grace. Now look, this man was an old guy who couldn't run for his life. His son had developed an army that no one could beat, it would seem. And any minute he could bust through the door, but he hadn't gotten there. But David was aware. He says in verse 6, "There are many saying, 'Who will show us any good?' Well, Lord, lift up the light of your countenance upon us. Show us who you are," basically. The enemy had not attacked, but I suspect there were lots of folks around David that were in despair, wondering out loud, who's going to help us? Who's going to pull us out of this? Where can we possibly turn to? We're sitting ducks. We're dead. For years, God had graciously blessed David and his court. Yet with every new trial came a new set of challenges to faith, and this was a big one. I would say to you, one of the lessons you should carry away from this chapter is that you should face your present difficulties in light of what God has done in the past. Don't forget what God has done. 45 years ago, I started a prayer journal that I still have. Well, I have 19 books of them. In the hopes of trying to track what God did in regards to my prayers. Because I remember early on as a young Christian, it was like me and Santa Claus. I would run in and ask for a million things. And then the next day, hi, I'm back, another list. I hope you can take notes, And never really stuck around to find out what God was going to do. And so I started taking notes and watching what the Lord did in results to prayer. Some of them took years to answer. Some of them answered in ways I would never expected. There are several that are still on the books. But it's so good to not miss out on what God is doing. This very night, David realized he'd been delivered yet again by God's grace. And though there were people around David who seemed to be in despair that no one could help, who can we turn to now? David realized it was the Lord who he could trust. And so he says to the Lord, shine your light of your presence, your countenance upon us. In other words, show everybody who you are, who's with us. And if you and God, who can be against you, really? And though some had remained moody and fearful, knowing that any time they could die, David was sure that God was able. In fact, he said, and this is remarkable, I think, verses. He writes in verse 7, You've put gladness in my heart more than in the season that the grain and wine is increased, and so I'm going to lay myself down in peace and sleep. For you alone, Lord, can make me dwell in safety. It's an amazing verse. For David to say, in this condition of knowing you, I find more happiness and joy than I did in the years when the harvest came in, when everyone took off work and began to count their gain and fill their barns. He literally says, faith is better than sight. Faith is better than sight. Look, nothing has changed here except David's understanding personally now of what he has. It is a reward for faith when the peace and rest God gives is far better and more sure to you than money in the bank, food in the refrigerator, and reserves at the ready. Victory in faith was his and can be yours as well. Everyone will rejoice once the problem is solved. God's people can rejoice before it's solved because of who God is. So I'm going to bed, David said. I'm going to go sleep. You're my protector. While Abeelen was back in Jerusalem, busying himself amassing a huge army to bring what he hoped would be the knockout blow to his father, David went to sleep with peace and the safety of the relationship that he has with God. I think it was Spurgeon who wrote, they slumber sweetly for whom faith rocks them to sleep. And David was going to sleep with his eyes upon the Lord. Well, finally, there's then the next morning, Psalm 5. Again, it is before the battle, before the resolution, before 40 hours have passed, and his confidence in God is sure, though the outcome is still in doubt. I'll spoil the picture a little. We know from 2 Samuel 18 that eventually a battle did come, but by then David had gathered so many faithful troops that it really wasn't much of a battle, and the coup was overthrown very quickly. David didn't want his son to be killed, but he was, and David was brought back to the throne in Jerusalem. But that's reading ahead. Here, the only light he has is one of faith and confidence in the God that he has been serving. So he starts the next morning with these words, God, give ear to my prayer and consider my meditations and give heed to the voice of my cry, my King and my God, for I will look to you. My voice shall you hear in the morning, Lord, And in the morning, I'll direct it to you. I'll look up. David is certainly bold in his prayers. He begins his words with the words, give ear, which is only one word in Hebrew, but it literally means to cup your hand behind your ear and bend forward so you could hear better. He literally says to the Lord, hey, pay attention. Listen up. Kind of like, a dog that can hear what others cannot. I want to pray to you, Lord. I want you to hear what I'm saying. You're my king and you're my God. And David was carrying some awfully heavy burdens. But notice he's going to turn to the Lord with those concerns. The word meditation in verse 1 is only found here in the Bible and in Psalm 39, verse 3, where it's translated musing. By definition, this word means to whisper so quietly that you can't hear it with your ears, but it is a cry of the heart. It is a communicated concern that really only God could understand. And so David is literally saying, Lord, listen, bend down, listen. Here's my heart to you and before you. To you I direct my prayer. The word direct means to line up like wood in a fireplace or on an altar. David thought things through. I'm going to direct my prayers to you. And then notice at the end of verse 3, and when I'm done praying, I'm going to look up. How important that we don't just pray and move along, right? That's the old prayer journals that I've kept over the years. You don't want to pray and leave. You want to pray and wait and watch. And how is the Lord going to answer prayer? I had a prayer list for my mom and dad when I got saved, and it took 12 years for my dad to get saved. And every week on this book for 12 years, I prayed for my dad. For 3 of those years, he wouldn't speak to me because he said he'd sent me to a Catholic education, spent a lot of money. It was hard on the family, and I forsook him. But 12 years later, God answered my prayer. He got saved. Now, I didn't get to lead him to the Lord. One of the guys from church here did, and I never will speak to them again. They took my job. Not fair. No, I'm kidding. But my dad's in heaven today because of the faithfulness of God to answer prayer. So I'm glad we kept track. So David said, I hear, Lord, look down, listen to my heart cry. I trust you. You're my God. You're my king. Here's my concern. So I'm going to pray and then I'm going to watch. He goes on and he says, for you're not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness, nor shall evil dwell with you. The bold won't stand in your sight. You hate workers of iniquity. You destroy those who speak falsehood. You hate or abhor the bloodthirsty and the deceitful man. David, besides knowing that God was for him, also knew what God was not for. Wickedness, lawlessness. The pursuit of Absalom was wicked. The wicked have very short wings. Their flight won't be very long. They have no footing. For a while, very glib Absalom developed quite a following, but it didn't last because God hates deceivers and murderers, and that was Absalom's buddy. He had no future. David was sure of that. He goes on, he said, but as for me, I'm going to come into your house in the multitude of your mercy, and in fear I worship you towards your holy temple. David felt he had an attitude of reverence for the Lord, that he could look forward to once again coming to Jerusalem and back to the sanctuary where God met with his people. So, Lord, help me. Show me how to walk. Make my ways clear. And lead me, verse 8, in your righteousness because of my enemies. Make your way straight. I don't want to make a wrong decision here, Lord. Lead me. Back to the history for a minute. When David had left town with his family a day and a half before, they had followed him out, some priests did, carrying the Ark of the Covenant from the temple to accompany him. Let the Lord go with you. And David said, the Lord's going with me. You send him back. That's where he put his name. If God is for me, he'll bring me back here to worship. But I don't need to take the presence of God in that sense with me. His name had been placed in Jerusalem. And so David writes that here. Lord, I want to come back and worship you because I fear the Lord. I want to be back where you are. My son doesn't fear you, nor his people with you. He goes on and he said, there's no faithfulness in their mouths, their inward part destruction, throats like open sepulchres, flattering with their tongue. Pronounce them guilty, God. Let them fall by their own counsel. Cast them out in the multitude of their transgression. They've rebelled, not against me, they've rebelled against you. But let all of those who rejoice put their trust in you. Let them ever shout for joy because you defend them. Also those who love your name, be joyful in you. You, Lord, will bless the righteous. With favor you'll surround them as with a shield. So by comparison, the enemy I'm fighting is not walking with God. God is with me. He's faithful to me. Lord, deal with them by judgment. You know, it's kind of poetic because the deceiver had been deceived. He was kept from the battle, and he was going to reap what he sown. On the other hand, if you trust the Lord, even though you haven't seen it yet, you can come to a place of great joy. He defends you. He's your hope. So rejoice in your trust in the Lord, even though you don't see the victory. And shout for joy as he defends you, even though the enemy looks to be, at least now have the upper hand. And love God because he will bless those who love him. It's always helpful, isn't it, to study the Psalms in the context, don't you think? It gives the verses a greater impact, I think. It is my intention over the next few months to do some Psalms in their context so that we might maybe grab hold of some of them a little tighter. But look, know this. Whatever you're facing this morning, if you're walking with the Lord, you're fine. You can rejoice before the answer comes. I'll show you my prayer journal. I should have been rejoicing on Tuesday when Saturday God was going to do something, but a lot of times I'm upset on Tuesday. But I'm learning, and I hope you are too. Father, thank you this morning for your word to us. It is certainly a word that we want to take to heart. David's long weekend was certainly miserable. He didn't know what was coming. The enemy seemed to have the upper hand. Nothing was going his way, and yet, through it all, David found himself just resting in your care and in your provision and in your love. Father, that we might this morning realize as well that we don't always get to see the outcome immediately of our faith. And we might often feel guilty that we've kind of caused the situation we now find ourselves in by having done the wrong thing, made the wrong choices, and now need to live with some of the consequences. But Lord, we know that you're the Lord. You're our God. And walking with you will always give us victory over the enemy and over the world, over the flesh, that you can be counted on to be our God, our King, our help, our Adonai, our Elohim, our Jehovah. So may we learn from David, the old guy on the run, that there's a peace and a rest that is more joyful than harvest season, and by which we can go to bed and rest in you. You're our salvation, and your promises are sure. Shall we stand?